Welcome, my friends. This is the X Numbers podcast. Normally, I'd introduce myself as Scholarch McLarney, but today I'm not. I am the fool who saith in his heart, there is no God. That's the role I'm playing today. And with me is none other than...
I guess I'm Schoolman Fawcett, Scholastic Fawcett, because today we're talking about one of the first scholastics. Some people would say the first scholastic. Yeah. I wouldn't really agree, but a candidate. Schoolman Fawcett and Scholarch McLarney and myself are teachers at the Chesterton Academy of St. Isidore Learning Center, the world's only online Chesterton Academy. This podcast is classical Catholic education in podcast form. These episodes are a sample of what it would be like to be in one of our classes, and our classes are based around the medieval model, or try to be, of dialogue, right? Mm-hmm. Of trivium, right? You got grammar, then logic, then rhetoric, and logic is all dialectic and discussion, and it's captured in the Socratic dialogues, and it's captured in a lot of medieval writings as well. Thomas's Summa is kind of structured as a dialogue in some ways. Mm-hmm. Anselm wrote dialogues like Cur Deus Homo, which we'll have to do an episode on one day.
Yes.
So this episode is we're focusing on a particular text which we might talk about in one of our philosophy or religion classes here at Chesterton Academy, and that is the Proslogion by St. Anselm.
Yeah. So you're St. Anselm then?
I guess I'm having to stand in the role of St. Anselm, who I mangled a bunch of facts about before. Like I said that he had previously been the Archbishop of Lanfranc, and afterwards I'm like, oh, I'm insane. Like that, Lanfranc was his predecessor as Archbishop, and I think I got Beck confused with. To me, I'm an Anglophone. You're right. He's Anselm of Canterbury, but he's also known as Anselm of Beck, and he's Anselm of somewhere else that I don't know about because Canterbury is all that's important, right? He ended up in England. He wrote the Proslogion before he ended up there. But for those of you scholars out there who listened to our previous episode and were like, Fawcett got a bunch of facts wrong. Yes, I did. I apologize. And I'm not even going to try to talk about him right now. All I'm going to say is he was a great saint and thinker who came up with what is commonly called, since the time of Kant, the ontological argument, which he puts forward in this book called the Proslogion. And then had to defend later on, which we'll talk about that as well. And we did a previous episode where we just talked about the introduction and the first chapter of the Proslogion, where I argue, looking at it, that for Anselm, the argument's not supposed to be something, which we'll get into what the argument is in just a second, but this is not supposed to be an argument that you just give to somebody and they're like, wow, you have changed my mind and I see that God exists. Because the setup for it is, he's like, I'm plunged into darkness and I can't find you, Lord. Lord, please reveal yourself to me. And God answers by illuminating his mind and showing him the ontological argument. So this is supposed to be sort of an act of grace. This isn't something that is achieved by our own human understanding. So Anselm, he's very Augustinian. I guess you could say everybody kind of was, until maybe Aquinas, who's also an Augustinian thinker in a lot of ways.
Well, he didn't have much else to read. Other than, he had some access to...
he had access to
Aristotle.
He had access to the Stoics.
Limited.
In his monastery, which is going to be important, actually.
Well, Seneca, right?
He had access to Seneca, exactly.
So, but Augustine would be the one to read, and I guess it's worth mentioning that even Augustine didn't read Plato or Aristotle directly.
That's right.
But Anselm here he's not reading directly Plato, but he gets a lot from Augustine, and now and his worldview, what he's thinking.
That's interesting. So if you're like, I'm listening to these podcasts and I'm not reading Anselm for myself, well, we encourage you to go and read Anselm, but I guess not reading the primary text has some precedent for it. And of course, Augustine couldn't read Greek, so if you can't read Latin either, and you're just doing this all in translation, that's fine as well, or at least there's precedent for it.
Sure, but he wasn't necessarily reading in translation either, right? So he's getting it through Porphyry or Plotinus.
Plotinus, fair enough. So I know we've discussed before that we're both pretty fond of the ontological argument. It's a lot of Thomists aren't, because Thomas Aquinas seems to reject it. Hopefully we'll have time today for me to argue that I don't think he actually does. But he doesn't use it, which I think is a different thing. But let me just review quickly that something else to say about Anselm, and I think this is true of Aquinas too, is that before you understand him as a philosopher, he is a biblical commentator, right? Like he's a bishop ultimately, like he's an abbot, he's a mystic reflecting on the Psalms. And I think we discussed this, that the first chapter of the Proslogion, it quotes at one point Psalm 13, and it kind of feels like a psalm, right? He's crying out like, Lord, I can't access you. I can't find you.
Okay,
You're in darkness,
right.
and I
Yes.
can't get.
Yeah.
I'm so mired in my own sin that I can't find you. I even think there's a bit of dialogue between God and him in it. Just like there might be in a psalm where as you discussed, the narrative voice kind of changes from God.
Yes.
It starts off by saying, "Come here, little man, and withdraw into your closet and seek me," kind of a thing. Seek God.
Yeah.
So, what the ontological argument for God's existence is a commentary on Psalm 14, verse 1. All right.
Okay.
Which you alluded to.
So, right, yeah.
How does Psalm 14, depending on how you number the Psalms, but
Right.
Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, how do those begin?
Well, the fool saith in his heart, there is no God.
That's right. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Comes up twice in the Psalms.
Yeah.
That is the verse that he's actually riffing on. So I think that's important to understand too, is that this is a commentary on the Bible. So he's explaining why is it that somebody who denies the existence of God isn't just wrong, but is actually a fool. Even though there are some very bright people, apparently. What does it mean to say those people are actually fools if they deny the existence of God? And again, so what it is, as we mentioned, he wanted to title the Proslogion Faith Seeking Understanding, a phrase that we used right before we started recording. And that he gets that quote, that line, Faith Seeking Understanding, from the Septuagint translation of Isaiah 7.
Right, yeah.
Which is worth talking about really quickly. Isaiah 7 includes which famous prophecy, Dr. McLarney?
Oh, this is the virgin shall conceive.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Virgin will conceive, and Alma will conceive, however you want to translate. Parthenos will conceive.
Right,
Yes,
yeah.
A controversial topic for another day, but Judah is besieged with enemies, and the prophet Isaiah promises the king, if you believe in, God is going to deliver you from this, you can ask him for a sign, and he'll show you a sign. Don't be shy about asking for a sign. The sign he'll give is that a virgin will conceive. So it's a prophecy about Jesus Christ, according to the Gospel of Matthew. And if you believe, you will be established. Or Jerome says you will be permanent. It actually is the word. Like he uses the word permanent in Latin.
Right.
You'll be. But the Septuagint says you will if you believe, you will understand.
Yeah.
Deanna, do you have any kind of reflections on that? Because I think Augustine might use that translation too at some point.
Yeah, it's foundational for Augustine, how he understands faith.
Mm-hmm.
So,
do you want to elaborate on that? You're an Augustinian scholar. So.
I guess there's several layers to it, but so one is that faith without it, it's the starting point, right? So you go back to Aristotle, Plato with whether we know things through the senses or is it through the mind, right?
Yeah.
So what's our starting point? They're talking about establishing beginnings and so forth. So for Augustine, very much in the Platonic tradition, that beginnings point is within, right? So not in the senses, but within. So faith then is the starting point for understanding anything. So that's one bit. Is faith has the priority. The second point would be that faith is also reasonable. So in other words, it's not one cancels out the other, or that we have like fideism, where you just believe to the exclusion of detriment of your reason. Like for instance, it's one of the reasons why he left the Manichees. So the Manichees had this whole complex astrology that tried to explain eclipses, whereas Augustine pointed out, other people can predict eclipses, and mathematicians and so forth. What you're saying doesn't make any sense, and so their faith lacked that understanding, and so it couldn't stand.
Couldn't stand. There you go. There's no permanency there. There's not a good foundation there, basically. So your faith has to be established and to understand. Just like in a sense, like we're besieged almost by our enemies, right?
Yes.
Of unbelief and sin, right? And the prophet Isaiah is saying, have faith, right, in God, and the sign that God will give you is Jesus Christ. Have faith in that, and you'll be established. And that's what Augustine experienced himself.
Yes. And once that is established, there can be a third layer to it. Then, once you do have a belief that is established, then it has its own wheels that it can move on. So it has a basis in faith, but once it's established, then it can sustain itself in that sense, right? It can go off in its own direction. You can follow it through using the intellect, reason, the gift of reason. So the human being then is one that we have this gift of the interiority of faith, right? There's this understanding, but also we can exercise a reason established in faith into the world. So it has large implications for the realm of like creed, belief, right? But also just how we go about our daily life, looking at observing the world around us. So what are our starting points?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, the reason they're so key, right? I mean, that's been a common definition of theology, is that it's faith-seeking understanding.
Yes.
Some people would say that, in one sense, all sciences are faith-seeking understanding, because there's always a element of faith in any kind of cognition when you're studying any piece of evidence, right? You have faith that your senses are giving you accurate information, and you're building understanding based off of that. And so again, that's also where Anselm's starting from. Like, he's recognizing that, like, he has faith, he's longing for God, and thus he's asking God to show himself, and the answer to this is that God gives this illuminating argument. And it's also, and you can get this from chapter 1 too, the understanding, and I think Descartes got this right actually, that it's not so much that, like, here's an idea of God and we're going to use it to prove God's existence. It's more like that you've never heard this idea before, but once you think about it, you'll realize that God exists. It's like God's existence, the knowledge of that is implanted in us.
Yes.
Right? Which there's a bunch of church fathers who talk this way. John of Damascus does, and Anselm is carrying this on, right? Yeah. So the idea, and he says, I'm already made in your image, so I have a memory of you, but it's clouded with my sin and the darkness of my intellect because of the fall. So I need you to clear that up. So the ontological argument is almost more like, I think of almost like, imagine a really dirty garden or something, and there's like, you can see a treasure underneath the dirt, but you can't get to it somehow. And the ontological argument is God illuminating and kind of clearing that out of the way so you can see this thing that's already implanted there. Right?
Yes, and I think there's kind of three helpful points to make on that bit about, like, the garden or clearing what's beneath, right? So on one level, there's the logic, like the fool said in his heart, there's no God. Well, on a logical level, that is incompatible. Right, saying God, and if we understand what we mean by God, right? So if we're going to allow that, so there's a logical bit that needs to be cleared so we can understand who God is. But then there's the moral bit that you mentioned as well. So we can have this obfuscation because of sin, and so this needs to be cleared as well. And so so there's that bit, and then I guess the third layer to the beauty of this argument is that. There is this understanding of being that's beneath all. Well, it's in everything, right? So being is in everything, and everything it connects back to being. And so we have this natural, instinctive, I think, connection to, just being in reality, right? And so this argument clears the way. You mentioned, being made in the image and likeness of God, but I think it just clears the way for our intellects to more fully grasp what we're standing on.
I think so. I think this argument is meant to be kind of the lead into theology, kind of like now it's a science, So I think now is a good time to just kind of go through the argument.
Okay. So without further ado.
Well, yeah. So as I've sent to you, I have put it into 9 points because I think maybe you find this too, that when you try to explain it, sometimes it's easy to start almost in the middle.
Yes.
In a certain sense, like you actually need to lay some foundation that seems really obvious.
Okay. But
once you've laid then it becomes, it's not a syllogism because I've made it 9 points, but there's a kind of syllogistic structure to it. So I'm going to try to go through the 9 premises that I've sent to you.
What's the first one?
All right. So first of all, things can either exist in our imagination, or they can exist in both our imagination and in reality.
Okay.
The example Anselm gives is like a picture. When a painter plans beforehand what's going to execute, he has the picture in his mind, but it doesn't actually exist yet. But then when he's painted it, it's in his mind, and it exists. So there's 2 ways something can exist. It can either exist in just our imagination, or it can exist there as well as in the world outside of us.
Okay.
Seems easy enough. Seems obvious,
Yeah.
Point number 2. It's greater to exist in both imagination and in reality than to just exist in imagination.
Right.
So
I think most people agree with that.
I think that's intuitive enough. Yes. Yeah. That seems straightforward. Again, this is where laying this foundation can be like, why bother? Because if you start halfway through the argument, where most people do, it's easy to kind of start picking away at it. But that's why, again, establishing this structure, I think, gives it its power. Now, point number 3. This is where people start a lot of the time. God is defined by Anselm as a being greater than which cannot be conceived.
Okay.
That's the definition of God, which we'll talk about this, I'm sure, later. He doesn't actually invent. Apparently, it's in Augustine. Augustine kind of most stuff is Christian theology. You can find some precedent, and I think Boethius and the Stoics. It comes up in Seneca, but so we'll come back to that. But just that he says, if you understand what the definition of God is, it's God is a being greater than which cannot be conceived. Okay, that's point 3. Yeah. Point 4.
But he doesn't say being though. He says that which.
He said so. The word is, I think it's in Latin. It's aliquid. So quid, it's like a quid pro quo, this or that. Like it's, it's not. He doesn't say an ens. I don't think. Not at least not from what I remember looking at it. Ens would be the word for being or a being, and I don't. Where we get entity, he might use it at one point, but I think in chapter 2, 3, 4, it's mostly aliquid is what. So God,
I guess not that which nothing greater can be conceived.
Exactly. Yes. Which again is I'll just say it's a very circumspect. I think he's trying to honor apophaticism, right? Like it's not that we have some active. This is the Thomist argument against this, by the way. It's we haven't actually seen the essence of God, so we can't reason about it or whatever. It's like I think he knows that. So he's just saying you can conceive of this. Well, that's point 4. Point number 4 is that we can conceive of God. Which again, it seems obvious, but this is where some people will challenge and be like, "Well, no, we don't. We have no idea." That's actually that's Berkeley and Hobbes. Their argument was, "Well, we actually," because they're empiricists, right? They say, "Well, we actually don't have an idea of God," and that's the problem with the argument. But he's not saying you have an idea of what God is. He's saying we can conceive of God, and the evidence for that is that we're talking about Him.
Right.
The fact that you can say the word God, or the phrase "there is no God," means you can conceive of God, who, as point 3 said, is a being greater than which cannot be conceived.
Right.
So we can conceive of God. That's an important thing. Point 4. Seems obvious, but you got to say it. Number 5. Given all of this syllogistic stuff, if we can conceive of God, then He exists in our imagination.
Right. That kind of makes sense.
That seems.
If we're conceiving of an idea, or even just talking about a painting that might exist, we can at least conceive of the painting in our minds.
Sure. Yeah. We can conceive of what was it, Splinter in the Mind's Eye? That was going to be George Lucas's Star Wars sequel. If the first Star Wars had failed, he wasn't going to make the Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi. He was going to make just kind of this small scale movie called Splinter in the Mind's Eye, I think. And so we can conceive. I think it was been into a novelization. We can conceive of it, and it exists in our mind, but it doesn't exist in reality, right? We can conceive of good Star Wars sequels and prequels, and they don't exist in reality, right? They exist in our imagination, of course.
Okay, so that's point 6.
Point 6 is if God only existed in our imaginations, but not in reality, we could conceive of something greater than Him.
Oh yeah, okay. So if I'm just conceiving, like point 5 is I can conceive of God in my mind.
Yes.
And then point 6, I guess, is then if that's just limited. If God is limited to what I can conceive in my mind.
Yes. If God only existed in our imagination, we could conceive of something greater than Him.
Something even greater.
Because we would be able to conceive of something that exists in reality too.
Okay. So there's something even. All right. So if it's just in my mind, then He's not the greatest thing that.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it. So this is where I want to be really methodical here, so nobody accuses us of cheating.
Okay.
So number 5, if God existed only in our imagination, but not in reality, we could conceive of something greater than Him, i.e., we could conceive of something that exists in reality as well as the imagination. Point 7. But if God is a being greater than which cannot be conceived, and we have conceived of Him, we can't be able to conceive of anything greater than Him. But if God only exists in the imagination, then it would be possible to imagine something greater than Him. But this is an impossibility. It needs to be parsed, right? Because it can sound like people are saying, "Well, God is super great, so He must exist," right? But that's not the point. Is like if you could conceive of something greater than God, if you could conceive of something if you think God does not exist, that means you are positing that you can conceive of all kinds of stuff that are greater than God. But if you've conceived of a being greater than which can't be conceived, and you're conceiving about all sorts of stuff that's greater than it, well, no, you can't do that, actually. You're not.
Yeah, right, you didn't actually conceive.
Then that means that whatever you've conceived of isn't actually God.
That which, okay.
Which you've clearly conceived of God because you're talking about God.
Right.
So, number 8, therefore the being we have conceived of, greater than which cannot be conceived, must exist in reality as well as in the imagination, and therefore 9, God must exist in reality, as well as in our imagination.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, it sounds like a parlor trick almost, right?
Yeah.
But that's that's the very intriguing. As I think Russell said this, Bertrand Russell said that it's a lot harder to think it's wrong than to articulate what's wrong with it.
Right.
Like, where exactly in that set of ideas is there a logical flaw?
Yeah.
I'm not convinced there is one. But
Right.
what do you think? You're going to play the role of Gaunilo and be the fool, which we'll talk about Gaunilo in a second. But
yeah.
what do you think? What's your first reaction to it, or can you remember your first reaction to it, or what do you think somebody might say as an objection to it? Like,
Yeah, I mean, there's lots that can be said there. I think to is it Gaunilo?
Gaunilo. Yes.
Gaunilo, who comes up with the argument of the greatest island. I mean, to me, I actually find this argument convincing. So
yes,
it says.
So
if I'm going to play the role,
that was what Gaunilo did. I mean, that's the title of his response was "In Defense of the Fool," right? Or on behalf of the fool.
So we go. And then I guess another thing that's worth pointing out at the outset, and this is something that Gilson points out, is that how people react to this argument usually says more about their presuppositions. So it really points out what school they belong to, depending on how they situate themselves relative to the argument. Whether some are theists, certainly,
for sure, absolutely,
like Aquinas and so forth. But if you're going to emphasize perhaps nothing in the mind that was not first in the senses, or something like this. Right?
Yes.
So if you're going to go that route, then and also with Russell, well, we can't afford theism in our system at all. So this can't possibly work, even though they can't exactly say why. Right.
Yes.
So there's also this visceral reaction to it. So let's think of the fool here.
What would the fool say in response to this?
Yes. Well, I guess that the island objection. Well, what if I thought of an island that we haven't seen perhaps directly with our eyes, but it's I can't think of a greater island than this one that could possibly exist. So because it's the greatest island that I'm conceiving of, then therefore it must actually exist. It's using the same logic, because it's better to
it's a parody argument
than to just have be a conception of it. And if I'm thinking of it now, well, then it's I can't think of an island that's yet greater than it, so it must therefore exist. Otherwise, I haven't really conceived of
yes, exactly.
the island that is the greatest.
Yeah, that's the classic. That's the original objection, right? So if Anselm makes the argument like God is a being greater than which cannot be conceived, and it's greater to exist in reality than just in your imagination, and you've really conceived of him, well, then he must exist in reality, because that's better than it's greater to exist in reality than just in the imagination. Well, the first response to him, I want to talk about this in a future episode, but most of the medieval scholastics agree with this argument. It's actually known as, at the time, it's known as the ratio Anselmi, like the reasoning of Anselm, the argument of Anselm. Aquinas is said to disagree with it. As I said before, I'm not sure he does. He just doesn't think it works on people. Yeah. But the only one, I think St. Albert the Great mentions it, but doesn't comment on whether he agrees or not.
Okay. Yeah.
Gaunilo responds to him, and Gaunilo is just an aside. This is the only thing we have that Gaunilo ever wrote. It's not like he had this whole canon of thought, to the point where it's actually been suggested that maybe that wasn't his name. Like someone was maybe using a pseudonym because they didn't want to be, I don't know, maybe they thought it was controversial to disagree with this or something. Right. But I did find someone did track down a baptism certificate of a Gaunilo that would from the area where he's alleged to have been from. Apparently he was a real guy. One of these philosophers who kind of said one quick thing and that was enough to make a big impact. There's been a couple of those Gettier problems. There's one. He just writes one quick article in the 60s, and that's enough to establish him as a famous philosopher. And that's Gaunilo. So Gaunilo is I believe he's a prior or an abbot of a monastery.
Okay, yeah.
And he writes a response called "In Defense of the Fool." And he actually says in it, like, most of the Proslogion is great, because the Proslogion goes on and talks about all these qualities that God has. But he says, this particular argument, though, I don't know if it works. So in fairness to the fool, which more later, I guess. But if you use that reasoning, you could apply it to anything, right? So what if there's how does he phrase it? Like the islands of the blessed. It is said somewhere in the ocean is an island, which because of the difficulty, or rather the impossibility of discerning what does not exist, of discovering what does not exist, is called the lost island. This is before the TV show Lost.
Oh, right.
About an island. There was once the Lost Island.
Yeah.
They say this island has an inestimable wealth of manner of riches and delicacies in greater abundance than is told of in the islands of the blessed, and that having no owner or inhabitant, it is more excellent than all other countries which are inhabited by mankind, in the abundance with which it is stored. It's very like, just as an aside, just imagine this before the New World is discovered and all this, right? This is all just science fiction, right?
Yes.
Imagine if there was some country somewhere full of all sorts of riches to discover.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he says, basically, he goes on to say, couldn't you use that reasoning there? I can conceive of the island greater than which cannot be conceived. And it's greater to exist in reality than to just exist in the imagination. So wouldn't that mean that the greatest of all islands would have to exist somewhere in the world?
Right, yeah.
And that's still, I mean, I think that's probably, it's a fair, I mean, it's a good thing that Gaunilo made that objection. Because it's the best articulation you could of like, what's wrong with the argument itself, right?
Yeah.
Which is worth noting, I'll just say this, Gaunilo, how do I say this? Is this kind of a reductio ad absurdum? It's like, well, clearly there couldn't be such an island. That still doesn't really show a flaw in the argument. You could, I guess, say, sure, that means there's an island somewhere that's full of all sorts of treasures, right? But that's, of course, not what Anselm says. What he does say, though, is I just want to point something that he kicks off his argument by saying, this is the first line. So what's important, too, is in the future editions of the Proslogion, Anselm includes at the end, as an appendix, the full text of Gaunilo's objection and his response to it. Okay, so he clearly thought, like, he was glad that Gaunilo said this, and he welcomed the opportunity to clarify his thoughts, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. The way it starts off...
it's also following the tradition of dialogue.
Sure,
right?
exactly. That's a good point, too. Yeah.
Dialecticians who are going back and forth. And so, that's...
I guess it's true. It's a kind of dialogue preserved for us, interestingly. Yeah, that's a good way of putting that. He kicks it off. I just want to note this by saying, it was a fool against whom the argument of my Proslogion was directed. Seeing, however, that the author of these objections is by no means a fool, and is a Catholic, speaking on behalf of the fool, I think it is sufficient that I answer the Catholic. So I went and looked at the Latin for this, and the Latin for, it is sufficient that I answer the Catholic was sufficere mihi potest respondere Catholico.
I have a feeling you're going to give us a different translation.
I have to be honest. I actually checked Google Translate and it agrees with this. But it's sufficere mihi potest. Potest. It means to be able to can, right? Like it's from
potential.
Exactly. Yeah. So to me, it sounds like he's saying it suffices for me that it is possible to respond to the Catholic or to respond to a Catholic. So it seems to me like he's kicking us off by saying, if you were actually an unbeliever, I wouldn't bother doing this. But because you're a Catholic and you're not a fool, I'm happy to do this for you.
Okay, all right.
Now, I think that's also revealing because this goes back to... Well, because let's think about again, the whole point is, why is it that to deny God's existence makes you a fool? Because the first time I read Anselm, I thought, Anselm, you don't understand the Bible well enough. Because he seems to be talking about the fool as though it's like an intellectual fool.
Right.
Like, if you're somebody who affirms verbally that God exists, but then you deny his existence, you're clearly not cognitively aware enough to see that you're contradicting yourself. You're being foolish. And I thought, but Anselm, that's not what the word fool means in the Bible, right? What's a fool in the wisdom literature or in the Psalms?
Well, the fool ties in with moral life. Mm-hmm. So it's how one behaves, right? So there's a connection between your... how would you say this? I guess your inner dissonance or the whisperings of your heart, the direction of your heart, and where your feet walk. And so that would be, in that sense, in the wisdom literature, right? The fool is almost like setting up a parallel system to God, almost a parallel wisdom, if you like. So it's all your own set of moral beliefs, code, and so on. I guess contaminant with that would be your own set of thoughts, right? It's so set up in opposition.
Okay, so Psalm 1 kind of like they walk a different path in the way of the.
So the blessed, yes, compared to the those who sit in the seat of scoffers and so on, right? Who have this ephemeral existence, right? They're insubstantial. They will not stand in the way, right, of the Lord, right? So
they're running off their own way. Basically.
That's right. Yeah.
So
unlike the tree, right?
Unlike the tree, yes, they're not rooted. They're more like tumbleweeds or something, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, well, Anselm, if you only knew that, if only you knew your Bible better, you'd know that the fool doesn't mean. I thought it was this whole. At the time I was naive. I thought, oh, it's philosophical Greek, thought has led him to think of them. It's all cognitive, right? And he's missed it in the Bible. It's a moral thing. I now think that Anselm is smarter than me. I think he knows this because I think that's his whole point. Is someone who is a fool is morally opposed to God, and they're not seeking Him. So of course this argument isn't going to work on them because they're not listening, and they don't want it to work on them.
Right.
So yes, it's both. They're cognitively they're uttering something that's incoherent and that's foolish, but they're also not morally open to grace, right?
Sure. Yeah. Which would be like the Bertrand Russell crown take, right? So there's that bit. So I think there's both though that are going
for sure.
on.
Yeah, definitely.
So there's the intellectual bit if you've understood what we meant by God and by conceiving, and it's better not like that bit. And then I think there's the darkness of sin, right? Obscure.
Well, I think the argument leaves you without excuse, like Paul says in Romans, right? Like when you go through this argument, you see that God must exist. You don't have that out anymore.
Yes.
So it convicts you, but it's not meant that it's going to necessarily convince you. Maybe it convicts you, but doesn't convince the unbeliever, the fool who doesn't want to believe in this. And because Gaunilo is actually a Christian, he's not just. I don't think I'm saying you already agree with me on God, so that's or he's being just chauvinistic, like I won't dirty my hands with unbelievers. I think he's saying like it's actually like a mental, cognitive, moral question here. That's why we're capable of even talking about this with each other, because the unbeliever is hostile to God in his heart, right, and doesn't want to believe this. So I think that's going on there as well.
Okay.
Now. Basically, the argument then would be, and the way he phrases it is very cryptic. To be honest, it's very like wooden prose. It's not obvious. So rather than reading it, here's what I think he means by this in response. Well, he has this one witticism. He says, "If this argument works, I will give you your lost island, never to be lost again."
Okay.
What does he mean by that? Right. I think he's saying like, okay, well, think about what would it mean to be the greatest island possible? An island greater than which cannot be conceived. Well, is it greater to be spatially bound in the middle of an ocean, or is it greater to be omnipresent?
Right.
Okay. Is it greater to be
omnipresent?
I would assume, to be universal, right? And abounding. Is it better to just have material gold and treasures, or is it better to have the storehouses of all wisdom?
Right.
Because if it just has Robert Louis Stevenson treasure and map buried there, I could conceive of it being better than that. Is it better for it to be rational and sensible, or to be inert and dumb? All right, well, it would presumably be better. And the more, is it better to be confined and finite, or to be infinite? All right.
Okay.
And it's like the more you keep adding attributes to it, it's like, well, then this island is just God. Right? If you really tease out the implications of what it would mean to be greater than which cannot be conceived, no finite created being could possibly fulfill that. Like it ends up evolving into. And I mean, you could even, if you want to be like Augustinian and Platonic, like an island it participates in the ideal of island in the Logos, right? So you could say, well, in one sense, it's like Jesus, I am the true bread, I am the door. I mean, God is the true island in one sense, right? He's our eternal home. If you want to go down this route, we're the explorers, right? We're just seeking out God, right?
Right.
And He's our treasure, right?
Our infinite wisdom, right? Everything we could possibly conceive.
And I phrase it this way because I've seen some responses that are, and this is true, but they say, well, Anselm's point is that there can't be such an island because it's necessarily finite. An island by definition, even the word island, the Latin is insula, right? It's insular, right? It's necessarily finite and it's limited. So a limited thing can't be an infinite thing, and that's correct. Like that's another way of saying it. But I kind of like to think of it that way. Like let's just go down that thought experiment, Gaunilo. Like, and if you think it works on the island, then I will give you your island, and it will never be lost again. And it's God, So I kind of prefer to think of it that way. That God is the island of the blessed.
Right.
The converse of that is it's just an island. There's no being that fits the requirement, and that's why the definition is so helpful, right? It's a being, it's an aliquid or whatever, like that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Any thing you posit, literally anything you posit, will not fit that description because you could always conceive of something greater.
Yeah.
So Anselm's not just throwing out this definition and saying like, if you stick, this is going to be the response. If we talk about Kant one day, he's not just saying you stick this idea greater than which cannot be conceived onto anything, and now you've defined it into existence because it must be, otherwise. Oh, he's saying you've got to actually think it through, right? If you think about it, which is what he does for the rest of the Proslogion, it could only apply to this thing that Christians recognize as God, right? This person, this being, is God, right?
Right, and I think that goes back to that our conception of being and just being in this world, right? So if we think of, you talk about being, there's like chronologically, we have this, logically, we have being has a priority, but ontologically, God has a priority over being itself. But the fact that we're in this world and have being and experience it, it all points to somewhere, right? So the greatest island or pizza or Sunday or whatever you can think of, these goods are going to point towards something that is maximally, or at least in the direction of that which is beyond, which transcends all of this. And so that's why I guess it's a false analogy or dichotomy to pair it with an island, to pair God, a conception of God with something finite or I don't know whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. So, it fails to understand the analogy of being in some ways, or the creator-creature distinction, or something.
Yeah. And so that's why this argument. I think the genius of it is that it's rooted in our comprehension, or at least our experience of being, of just being here.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. And I guess that would be where, like, the idea that the knowledge of God's existence, as St. John of Damascus says, is implanted in us. Like, well, what does that mean? Like, does our baby sons, right? What does it mean to say they know God exists already, right? When they don't necessarily know, how to speak in some ways yet. Right. And I think that's part of it, right? Like, it's an awareness. I guess similar to how they kind of know the law of non-contradiction and the law of identity already, right? They know God exists in the same way, right? So something about our experience of being, right, itself points in that direction. And again, reason then has to kind of, just like they have to kind of learn to articulate what it is they're perceiving, and learn how to talk about the world, right, and clarify all this stuff. That's what theology is doing with this intuition, I guess, we have of God. That's implanted in us because of the image,
Yeah.
And I think about that, I want to say, again, when we one day do a future episode when we talk about the other forms of the ontological argument, I will say the peril of it, I think, is that it tends to tip over into pantheism.
Okay.
We'll see that with like Hegel,
Yeah.
his version of it. What's his face there? Spinoza, his version of it as well, and even the concept itself, even before Anselm.
Seneca. Anselm is riffing on this, or at least modifying.
This is my theory. So I've discovered this fact in my research, and I have my own interpretation of it. So I was looking up, did Anselm actually coin this term, argument, the definition of God, that he's agreeing being greater than which cannot be conceived? Because I could kind of see the argument of, well, Anselm, isn't that a little bit ad hoc? Here you are 1,000 years after Christ, and you're saying people are fools for not recognizing that God doesn't exist because of this definition that you just made up 5 minutes ago. I was kind of wondering, could you make that as a rebuttal to him? So I was looking up, was there anybody before Anselm who defined God? It's an easy definition to kind of get to from the biblical data.
Sure, yeah.
But was there any specific phrasing? And apparently it's in Boethius, and there's some of it in Augustine, who again was a pretty copious writer, so that's not shocking. But it actually even goes all the way back to Seneca, his Naturalis Questiones. Apparently there were a couple copies of that at his monastic library at Beck, so we would have had access to it. And in the preface to it, Seneca says, "What is God?" All right, this is a quote. "What is God? The mind of the universe. Everything that you see and everything that you do not see. His greatness, than which nothing greater can be imagined, is only attributed to him if he alone is everything, if he holds his work from the inside and from the outside." Now, so Seneca's a Stoic. Do you want to just kind of speak to what were the Stoics? What was their view of God exactly?
God is, I guess, synonymous with creation, and so there's kind of the universal, if you like, principles that are at work beneath, but a reality. But we are passive to the events of this world, and why it's kind of like a realization that honors, crowns, and so on. These are on the surface of being, right? These are just human kind of goals or desires, but they don't actually speak to the very ground of reality itself. So that's the whole bit. We get the word Stoic today as a
which referred to the porch where they were the Stoa.
The Stoa, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
but their thought was that idea of like a kind of passivity, towards.
That's right, and it's rooted in this understanding that we are one with everything. All right, and so today you get that same idea in Eastern religions as well.
For sure.
And so so God is synonymous then with creation, created order. So he's saying, I think he said there, like God was in the mind.
He said the mind of the universe. Yeah.
But also that God is everything and in everything.
That's right. Yeah. He holds his work from the inside and from the outside. Is how it's for everything that you see and everything you do not see. So it's not just that God is like the whole material creation, but I guess it'd be sort of like the material creation and like the laws of nature and the laws of logic or something.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of like it's a spiritual. It's not crudely materialistic pantheism, right? It's like a logos idea, right? Kind of the fire, I guess, that energizes everything.
Yeah.
So. Would you call it? I guess it'd be a kind of pantheism, and then the argument, I guess, for Seneca is that's greater than anything you could conceive of, right? You can conceive of, I guess, computers and microphones and jackets and all these things, but everything you can't conceive of anything greater than that, right? Of it all together. Yeah. This whole universe and its mind of the universe too.
Yeah. And
so I note that the ontological argument is presented in chapters 2 to 4, and that's where a lot of people stop reading. But what Anselm does, and by the way, Gaunilo does say at the end of his response, he's like, by the way, the rest of your book's really good. Is he kind of, I think he then takes it and unpacks it. He fleshes out, okay, if you're really greater than which cannot be conceived, what does that mean about you? And the very first thing he does is say, well, that means you can't be the same as the universe. And I feel like he's saying, this is again kind of Paul, right? Like there's natural evidence for God everywhere in the world, but we've perverted it, like Romans 1, right? And worship the creature rather than the creator.
Right. Yeah.
I kind of think subtly that's what he's doing with the Stoics. He's saying the Stoics knew about you. They used the reason to kind of recognize that from this definition that you must exist, but then they didn't think hard enough about it, right? Or they morally fell into the error of worshiping the creature rather than the creator. Because I've got that right here, but I think I picked the best. Chapter 5, what are you then, Lord God, than whom nothing can be conceived? But what are you except that which, as the highest of all beings, alone exists through itself and creates all other things from nothing? For whatever is not this is less than a thing that can be conceived of, but this cannot be conceived of you. And then in chapter 6, he goes on to say, you are not a body, but a supreme spirit who is superior to body, which again is kind of a refutation in advance of Gaunilo. Like, he can't be an island because God doesn't. Being greater which cannot be conceived wouldn't have a body, and that's what an island is. It's a body. So But specifically chapter 5, I kind of feel like that's him saying, all right, being greater than which cannot be conceived. Well, you know what's even greater than the universe? Something that created the universe, and not just something that created the universe out of itself, but out of nothing.
Right.
That's even greater. I can conceive of, if you could conceive of that, it would be even greater than the universe itself. So I think this is not, and again, we only are able to know this because of faith, because of what God has revealed to us, but reason shows that it's true, that it must be true. Yeah. That if you press hard enough into this idea that the Stoics already had, it actually ends up refuting the Stoics.
Yeah, and I think even Plato could point something like that out, right? So there's this the universe, and whether it's the laws of nature and so forth, but then there's the eternal realm, right? So there's something beyond that.
Right. Yes. And I mean, well, arguably, even in one sense, even for a Christian, even the realm of the ideas is in one sense a creative analog of the logos, because we wouldn't be things don't participate directly in the essence of God, right? So the ideas that we participate in are kind of like an interpretation of God that He's made for us, and so on. But maybe that's for another day. I just note that he then goes on and uses this to refute pantheism. which is important, because I just think the ontological argument is going to be, because it's easy to think, well, being itself. You can think of being and it must exist if you think about it, and that's the way to use the ontological argument. But if you just stop there, then it becomes pantheism.
Yeah, right. And it's not that hard to go further with it, right? And just say, well, there is something beyond being. It's the ground of being. It's the source. It's the reason for being itself.
But this concept itself does all that work. We talked about it last time. He says in the introduction, I wanted an argument that I wouldn't need to multiply arguments, right? Like he wrote the Proslogion, which was he calls it what's the Latin? It's like a contextum, it's like a, how would you explain it? It's like a bunch of threads woven together in Latin. It's an interwoven set of arguments. And he wanted to see, could I come up with one single argument that would prove everything? And he was pursuing it constantly, and he couldn't find it until finally it came up to him one day and offered itself to him. Right? And it's this one simple argument that, if you unpack it, gets everything else, that I think is supposed to parallel the simplicity of God itself. And so he will argue that this one idea, the being greater than which cannot be conceived, you can get the mercy of God and the love of God and the omnipotence of God out of it if you just think about it kind of hard enough, right?
Sure.
And therefore he's thanking God for illuminating him for it. And I think even leading into his whole theory of the atonement, right? That we therefore owe this being our full obsequience, but we failed to do so, and so now we not only do we owe him a perfect life, but we owe him something above and beyond that only he can deliver, which is also a perfect death. Right? So his whole theory, the satisfaction theory of the atonement, I think even that can be seen as like a sequel to this, right? Given that this being is the greatest possible being, therefore it demands our full homage, which clearly we haven't given him, right? Which then entails all of the redemption, right? That's going to come afterwards. And his theory of the atonement, I think, is just as tightly argued and well worked out as his ontological argument is. So the only other thing I want to add is just, did Aquinas reject this argument? And I'm just going to suggest, I don't think he did, because if you look at what the objection that he's dealing with, is the existence of God self-evident? And Aquinas says no, because it's possible to deny, you can't deny the existence of something that's self-evident, but the fool has said in his heart there is no God.
Right.
So he's using the same proof text as Anselm. But Anselm never denied that either. Right? Anselm knows that there are fools who deny the existence of God.
Sure. Yeah.
So him and Aquinas aren't really disagreeing with each other. All right? I think Aquinas' concern is to come up with arguments that will persuade people, and that's what the 5 ways are, right? That you can show to anybody, and they'll recognize that God must exist from that, in a way that the ontological argument doesn't do. But but it's important. Aquinas even says in other places, like, you can deny, I think, how does he phrase it? Like, orally, you can deny the law of non-contradiction. If you think about it and what it really means, you can't. But it's possible to, on one level, like, not know that the law of non-contradiction exists. Like, I can say, well, the law of non-contradiction is possible. In fact, Hegel does say this, right? Hegel actually, right? Exactly. So clearly, like, in one sense, there's no premise that you can't, in some level, deny. He's just, but if you properly understand it, you'll recognize that it must be true. Now, like the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and for Anselm, also the existence of God, right? If you think about what that must mean. Again, Aquinas is more of an empiricist, so for him, it's going to be. He makes the point that, like, he kind of implies that the ontological argument would work for angels because they know what the essence of God is, or the saints enjoying the beatific vision. They know it, so the argument would work for them, but they don't really need it.
I guess they're not going through the senses first or something like this.
Right, yeah. But again, I think maybe he didn't think it was a good argument, but he's not specifically refuting it. He's just saying, he's acknowledging it's not, God's existence isn't self-evident to everybody because there are fools. There are people who deny the existence of God, are capable of it for whatever reason, which Anselm doesn't deny either. So I just kind of think they're talking about the same thing from different realities and approaching it from different realities. Not to say that they don't have genuine differences in epistemology and all that, if you press it, but just that I don't think, I think it's more complicated than you sometimes hear. To say Aquinas just doesn't accept the argument. Because he's not saying whether it is true that a being greater than which cannot be conceived must exist in reality. He doesn't go into that at all. The only thing he's dealing with is the existence of God self-evident, which he says it is in itself, but it isn't always to us because there are people who do deny the existence of God. Fair enough. Anselm does not disagree with that. but maybe they're talking about the self-evidence of God in different ways.
Right. Yeah.
But regardless, I mean, so that's Anselm's version of the ontological argument. I've heard it called the argument about which more has been said than any other argument in history, which might be true.
The argument that which not
about
can be said.
More about greater than which more cannot be said about.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, there's.
Well, we'll talk about name for this argument.
Oh, hey, I tell you,
it
actually
takes a bit longer.
That'd be a good. Yeah, it's a little wordy, but it's very witty. And someday, in the future, I'd like to do another episode going through Bonaventure's version, Spinoza's, Leibniz's. We'll go through Kant's objection, Russell's. We kind of touch on because Russell was persuaded by it for a bit.
Right.
What Hegel and Marx do with it.
Great boots.
Great God in boots. The ontological
boots.
argument is sound, he said.
Yeah.
But it convinced him of the absolute. Right, not of the Christian God. So he became a Hegelian for a bit.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you're a step closer, I suppose.
It's a start, but and where he ends up actually kind of going is to say, language just doesn't relate to reality, right? Our language. That's really how Russell ends up getting out of it. Is like that would work if language corresponded to reality, but it doesn't. Language is just a functional tool that.
Okay, so he's going to embrace nominalism.
That's where, like, in a really extreme form, I think it's the only way out of it, basically. Which that's why I'd like to get into with them in the future. Is some of the other objections that have been raised, where I think basically you have to say, it kind of comes down to, do you think our words correspond to reality, or does our thought and our language have anything to do with reality or not?
Right.
Because you could say, what it seems to me is, if you can act as though God doesn't exist, then you have violated the ontological argument, right? Now you could say the way our minds are configured is such that we can't conceive of something greater than God, and we have to act as though he exists, but maybe he actually doesn't. Like, maybe you can bite the bullet and kind of do that in a kind of Kantian way, but at that point you have to basically abandon, like, you have to plunge yourself into complete skepticism. And which I think, and if you believe that our minds are connected to reality in some way, then I think Anselm's argument works. I think you have to jettison the possibility of any knowledge at all to really refute the ontological argument. Yeah.
And I mean, it's a related topic, but it's an analogous one is the reasonableness of reason. So there's a certain faith that's needed in that as well. So not just having a faith in realism, but faith in reason, which is another type of skepticism, right? And that, can we know things at all?
Well, that's a whole other. I mean, that gets into this question of, I guess, the argument. So that's funny, because that's where some Christian philosophers have said, actually, you need to presuppose the existence of the triune God in order to, like, have any basis for, like, you have to believe that God is good. And I mean, Descartes kind of starts this ball rolling, right? But and maybe Bonaventure does too. That you have to believe that God created our senses and created our minds and created the world to be intelligible. And if you don't have that as a presupposition, you actually don't have any basis for believing in your senses or believing in your reason.
Right. Yeah.
Which also the philosopher John Frame has said that transcendental argument for God's existence is actually a form of the ontological argument. It's positing something greater than greater than anything in our thoughts, that grounds all of our thoughts and is the basis for everything that we can. So maybe that in a sense we're back with Anselm again. Yes, right, that argument that we have to believe in God to trust our senses is maybe an Anselmian one. Maybe it's the ontological argument redux, right?
So, yeah, well, I think it's just another facet of his thought, right, and where he's coming from.
There's one idea, right? It's infinitely. Yeah. This is why I argue that it's perhaps the most important argument in the history of philosophy, just because of all the implications that come from it. And
yes, and it is illustrative of. Again, the presuppositions that others hold.
That line from Gilson is really important. Yeah, that basically, like, whether you buy it or not is going to reveal a lot about you, which maybe is what Anselm wanted. He wanted to kind of challenge you to be like, well, what do you think, right?
Yeah.
Like what, and what does it mean to believe in all this? What is it? Understand a bit what it means to have this faith, I guess. So that's part 2 of our ontological argument discussion. And one day we'll do a part 3 where we get into its history. But for now, Dr. McLarney, do you want to close us out in prayer?
Sure, let us pray. In the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. We call upon you, our Lord and God. You revealed yourself to us through the cross and resurrection of your Son. We thank you, Lord, for the gift of faith which you give to us. May you continue to nourish that faith, and we grow in our understanding, our knowledge and wisdom of you. We thank you for the saints who have come before us, for St. Anselm, who's given us much food for thought and stirring up our hearts and our minds, that we may better understand and glorify you and have a ground on which we stand as we worship. And so we give all glory to you who reigns forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.